This is the Revolution Today podcast, episode number 9. Before we get started with today's video, I want to shout out our sponsors here. If you go to my link in the description, you can find links to 2 of my shops. Amazing products, amazing designs. Check those out. Etsy and Redbubble. Good prices, good products, all around good stuff. And I also have a Patreon. If you'd like to support me instead of buying products, you can support me through Patreon. I gotta update all the different levels and all that because I made that how many years ago, and the problem is, it just didn't. It just wasn't what I wanted it to be. So, yeah. But anyways, let's get into the episode.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out from here during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
All right. So I want to talk about what I'm reading. I haven't finished the book that I'm reading currently. I'm in the process. I'm like halfway through, which I gotta finish because I've got a trip coming up, but I gotta finish that before I leave, so that way I can begin reading my other books. But I'm reading the book called State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin, the famous Russian socialist leader, the man who took a country full of peasants, workers, slaves, and overthrew the royal family, the Tsar, and became a hero to many, and essentially started what we know now as the Soviet Union. Yeah, the book, it's so far, it's pretty good. There's a lot of talk about Karl Marx and callbacks to him, specifically and I remember this specifically, it goes into detail about the Paris Commune and that whole uprising in an attempt to start a commune in Paris, and essentially was the beginnings of a socialist revolution. It was the beginnings of essentially communism. What they were trying to do was essentially create a commune that had no government, that had no classes, no money. It didn't work in the end because the French government, of course, fought back and took that commune and demolished it, destroyed it, just wiped it out. So it didn't end up lasting long, but as long as it lasted, it kind of painted a picture of what communism could be, and it's inspired Marx to begin writing about his ideas on socialism, communism, and really what he thought was the future. Because at the time, now you could argue whether capitalism at the time was sufficiently past its due date, in terms of like infrastructure and machinery and the technological advancements of the time. You could argue, yeah, maybe it was long past overdue. Others would say maybe no, capitalism needed to last a couple years longer, maybe a couple decades longer. I mean, in America, yeah, I'd say capitalism needed to last maybe at least until, in my opinion, the 30s or the 40s. In Russia, the opposite was true because by 1917, the Russians had already begun the revolution in October to overthrow the Tsar and build a socialist government. So they were at the point where capitalism was no longer necessary because the need for capitalism had been outgrown because, of course, the technological advancements had pushed on past the point where it was needed for continuing the advancement of society. I mean, well, really, you got to look at it like the means of production, society in general. I mean, as communists, we don't disagree that capitalism was necessary at one point to advance society forward, because look at this. You had, if you remember back in the Middle Ages, there were feudal systems in place, feudal lords ruling over these peasants who would work the land and work the fields to feed the lord, and then the lord in turn would offer protection and security to the workers and the peasants who needed it. So we were in a state of feudalism in the Middle Ages for the longest time, and what we needed was the next step in the evolution of the society, and that evolution of the society was capitalism, because we were in a position where we needed to have a more advanced means of production. And the fact that before it was just lords ruling over land, serfs and peasants farming the land, and it was more like small time production. You didn't have like these large factories with these machineries and these assembly lines. It was just you had the farmers, the serfs, the farmers. Then you had like a couple people here and there doing like metal work and stuff, but it wasn't like full scale, like industrial type. It was like, again, small scale manufacturing and very light production of certain goods and necessities like weapons and such. But yeah, like capitalism was the next step in the evolutionary process by which society begins to grow. We outgrown the need for feudal systems because, there was just this need for a more robust, more technologically advanced means of production. And so and now that these lords were no longer needed, then you saw the creation of a new class. See, now you had essentially in a similar style, although what became of the lords, they didn't rule the land, they ruled the means of production, and they ruled labor itself. So we went from feudal lords ruling over the land and providing security to now owners of the means of production providing jobs and wages for these people in exchange for their work and their labor towards the business. So you saw the creation of these businesses, these factories. These early versions of factories where the workers would run the machines, and then the owner would pay them a wage. Now that was just the early version of capitalism. And at the time it was necessary because society wasn't built up enough structurally, integrally. They weren't. If you were to say, okay, we're going to go from feudal systems to socialism, it wouldn't work that way, because socialism relies on the infrastructure and the foundation of capitalism to begin to progress forward in time. So if you were to say, okay, here's a feudal system, we're just going to go straight to socialism, there's nothing that was created, there's no infrastructure in that system to be able to progress, to skip over capitalism and progress to socialism. There just wasn't that infrastructure, that foundation. So capitalism was necessary. So when capitalism first started, you saw the rise of these businesses, these factories, where it wasn't no longer like kings or lords or these royal families running the land and owning the land. You saw the rise of like these business owners running these businesses, and workers going from being peasants and slaves to becoming now workers in a factory and being paid a wage. So for a time, yes, it was necessary for the creation of the capitalist infrastructure, or not the capitalist infrastructure, but the infrastructure of the society of the people. So so we have the infrastructure. Capitalism begins to build, but there becomes a point where you've progressed technologically, where you just end up plateauing, because the goal of capitalism was to build up the factories and the means of production and progress those things technologically forward. But then there comes a point where everything is pushed forward enough to where it doesn't need capitalism to exist anymore. That's why you look at today, you have, what are we producing? TVs, monitors for computers, keyboards, desktop PCs, laptops, like unnecessary stuff. Because capitalism, there's no need for it to exist anymore. Because we're producing unnecessary stuff, when if we were to transition to socialism, we would be producing the more meaningful, necessary stuff to advance society forward. So, have we outgrown capitalism? Of course. When did we do that? For the Russians, it was the early 20th century, because by the 1917 revolution, they had already built up the infrastructure necessary to advance onward to socialism. But for the United States, I would argue maybe 30s and 40s, like I said earlier, 30s and 40s would be the decade that I would suggest they would have been fully developed by then. But if we go even further, regardless of, speaking of when socialism should have been implemented in the United States, the peak of American capitalism was in the 50s, because in the 50s you had well, thanks to the war. That's the thing. The war, the World War II, I should say, World War II. We bombed Europe completely, Germany and the United States. Germany was bombed by the United States and the Allies, and Germany bombed like literally every country they could in the European front, and a little bit in the Eastern European front too. But then you had Japan, same thing. They pretty much just wiped out Asia and everybody, and so there was a need for products. And the only country that was left untouched by the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific was the United States. So therefore, the United States was producing more than enough, more than they needed, because that all was going towards the international community. So you had very low unemployment, many jobs available for people, because you had the veterans of World War II. They'd come back, they'd find a job like within a matter of days. That's how many jobs were needed, because we were supplying the world when it came to products and cars and other things, because they didn't have the factories or the infrastructure, because all that was destroyed during the war. So we had all the necessary components to it was really a perfect storm. Everybody else was struggling. They had no factories. Everything was destroyed. So we began pumping out products and then shipping them overseas. So there was many jobs that were needed to be filled. So you had low unemployment with a high number of jobs needed to be filled. You had also cheap housing, just cheap everything in general. I mean, housing was really cheap. So you had people who could afford, they were working their jobs wherever it was, factory, office, whatever, and they could afford a house with a car, and they could feed their children. Like, that was the peak of capitalism in America, because you had high wages, many jobs, cheap housing, and really it was just a time of like prosperity. But like, that was about the peak, because as you saw, after the 50s, the world started to catch up. So, the UK started getting factories rebuilt, Germany rebuilt factories, France, same thing, everybody. All over Europe, they were just rebuilding, and they eventually caught back up. So there was no need for products anymore, because they could make their own. So then that's when the peak of capitalism in America really started to fall down, because once that happened and all those countries caught back up, you saw the lowering of wages, the high unemployment, and high inflation. It just got worse, and it hasn't gotten better since. No matter how many presidents you see, like Biden, Trump says, "Oh, I'm the jobs president, the greatest jobs president God ever created." Okay, I mean, it may be true, but the problem is it will never be as good as the 1950s. That's why you see all these conservatives who want to go back to the old days, because in the old days there was a lot of jobs, high wages, cheap housing. I mean, they want to go back to that, but you can't, because capitalism has run its course. So going back, what I was saying, the 70s, the 80s, with Reagan especially, is when it really took a downturn. But 70s and 80s, manufacturing jobs were leaving the United States, going overseas by that point. I know specifically, I used to live in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, and so a lot of the steel mill jobs in Pennsylvania and the Pittsburgh area started disappearing. I mean, these steel mill factories were being abandoned, shutting down. Everything was just disappearing from these people's lives. So you had once thriving towns and cities outside of Pittsburgh, they started to collapse and fall apart, because see, what happened was, you would have these workers go to the city downtown to work the steel mill jobs. Then they take the wages they have from that and bring it back to their town or city that was outside of the city limits in Pittsburgh, and they would start using that money to spend on things. And so then you would have small businesses pop up, because these small businesses would rely upon the wages of the steel mill workers who worked in the city. So then you had these small businesses pop up, and they would, of course, do their business with these steel mill workers who, are getting paid to work in the city. And so everything was booming. But then, as the world caught up, with means of production, the infrastructure necessary to make their own products, then you saw a lot of these manufacturing jobs leave, which meant that a lot of these towns outside of big cities were starting to collapse and disappear, because there was no longer the wages from the steel mill workers to supplement their business. So these steel mill workers stopped getting paid because they got fired. And when they stopped getting paid, they stopped going out and buying things from these small businesses. And therefore, these small businesses would lose money. And in the end, they would have to close. I see it all the time. I drive through many towns, many parts outside of Pittsburgh, and there's just, everything's dead. What used to be like thriving, like towns and cities, they're all dead. The businesses have closed. Everything's run down. I mean, and that's really the thing. That really goes back to the fact that capitalism had peaked. It was on the downward turn. And then, getting into Reagan's whole idea was, hey, let's just cut the taxes of the corporations, and then the money will go right down to the workers. What he didn't take into account, and I don't know if it was because he was dumb or he just didn't care, when you give tax breaks to the corporations, they're going to take that extra money and pocket it themselves. The CEOs, the executives, the upper level people are going to take that money, pocket it themselves, and leave the workers with crumbs. And that's exactly what happened. You had the workers who were told by Reagan, hey, we're going to give the tax breaks to the corporations and the rich, and then they're going to pass the money down to you. They never saw that. They were fed a lie, and they never ended up seeing any of that money that they were promised, because corporation gets a tax break, they're going to take that extra money and pocket it as profit and pay off their executives. And that's what I was talking about earlier. I posted something to Facebook about wage theft, and then I talked about how wages are just expenses. So the worker is in essence an expense to the business or the corporation. So the goal of the corporation or the business is to lower the wages because they are expenses. Their goal is to lower expenses to make the most profit. And so they're going to try to undercut wages by a large sum just so they can rake in more profit. There's no reason to, because there's no reason somebody should have $200 billion. I mean, that's enough to buy everything on the planet and then have left over. What's the point of having $200 billion? There's no point. It's just hoarding wealth. So these corporations, they take in all the profit, leave the workers with nothing, and then, conservatives say, well, Reagan's a good president. He's amazing. He stopped communism. He saved the country, and he was great. But the average worker will tell you he's terrible. I was working all these hours, and I was told that tax breaks to the rich and the corporations would bring money down to me, and then at the end of the day, I saw no money. I was still getting paid my low wage, and I wasn't seeing any sort of money coming my way. So that's when it really started. the downturn, the really big downturn of capitalism was when Reagan took office, and just pretty much just destroyed the working class. And it didn't help that he was a hardline anti-communist. And the fact is, since he's an anti-communist, you bet he was really critical of like government. He even said it himself. He said in a speech, I don't remember where it was or when it was. He says, what was it? It was 3 words. He says 3 words the government that are make you. Hold on, let me pull it up. Oh, yeah, okay. Reagan says the top 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So you know for sure, just off of that quote, forget he was an anti-communist, forget that whole thing. That quote alone should tell you that, hey, this guy was against government programs, was against government helping the people. And so, to top it off, the fact that he was anti-communist really played a part in him screwing over the working class and helping the rich. Because to him, anything that was even remotely positive and involved the government helping people was communism. So he really screwed over everybody except for those at the top. And the fact that he did that, it set in stone American policy and society for many decades after. He didn't care. He didn't care. He was just some actor from Hollywood that got elected. And since then, yeah, everything's been terrible. But we probably, getting back to what I was originally saying, we probably should have transitioned from capitalism to socialism somewhere around 30s to 40s, even 50s. Because by that point we were already advanced technologically with means of production and the infrastructure. So we probably by then should have progressed, but we didn't, and we still haven't. And capitalism, the reason why we haven't progressed is because those at the top won't allow it, because when there's a profit incentive, they're going to stick with the system that makes them the most money, because they know if they allow any socialist government or socialist revolution to happen, they're going to lose all their money and even their lives. So they can't afford to do that. So they have to find a way to keep the system running as long as it can. But the problem is, capitalism it relies on infinite growth. It's a system that it grows infinitely. Problem is, we live in a world where resources are finite. So you can't have an infinitely growing system in a finite world. It just doesn't work. Because at some point, you're going to run out of resources. Then what happens? Then you'd say, well, we'll just do what Elon Musk wants to do, and his whole thing is he wants to move everybody to Mars or start a colony on Mars and go from there. Problem is, his thing is just a guise. What he really wants to do is colonize Mars so he can begin to drain the resources from Mars for his own profit and gain. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's Elon or somebody else. Regardless, the goal of capitalism is once you run out of resources on your own planet, you go and colonize other planets to steal their resources. Just like how, let's see, like 400 to 500 years ago, when Columbus came over, they were looking for a new way to get across to the other side of the planet, to India. And what they did is they found the Americas. Problem with that is, when they found the Americas, they didn't say, oh well, there's people already here, let's just leave them alone. No, they came in, they took over, and they killed a lot of the native population. And so what they wanted, so what ended up happening was, when the English came over and started the colonies in North America, they began taking resources, they began stealing land. Well, the land's already stolen no matter what, but they began stealing more and more land, more and more resources, to the point where you can't even, there's barely a native population left in America right now. Their land was stolen. They've been forced into reserves, or whatever it is called. So there's not much of them left. I mean, there are, but America killed the native culture, because when was it? It was probably the 1850s onward. They had they started this really big campaign about getting natives to be civilized. And so what they would do is they would send natives to schools in the United States, which back then was not much past the Appalachia. So they would send these natives to school, whitewash them, make them quote-unquote civilized, as if you can't be civilized on your own, in your own culture, in your own way of life. But they wanted them to be civilized in terms of white people civilized. They were already civilized as natives because they could speak, they hunted for food, they had tribes, everything, but they wanted them to be whitewashed. So they would send them to these schools and strip them of their cultural identity, and they would force them to become really white people. I mean, they weren't white, but they wanted them to become what white people are, so they would have them go to these schools. They'd come out, they'd be changed, they'd forget everything they ever knew about their culture and their identity, and that's why the culture of the natives has disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. And so it was a real problem. The fact that we just came over unannounced, found out there's people living here, and decided to kill them all off and take over. That's what's going to happen in this space if capitalism continues to exist on Earth. Is we're just going to colonize other planets to steal their resources and take over their land. A lot of people like to put this into perspective, and they like to say, and I agree too, to an extent. They say that humanity is a virus, that the human race is a virus, that all we do is we take over, we invade, we kill off other species, and we grow in size. And that's kind of true. I agree mostly. I don't think that it's not so much that we do it on purpose. It's just how we live. and it can't. I don't think it can be helped to an extent, but it can certainly be drawn back a little bit. But yeah, this whole space thing with Elon, it's all a ploy to get us to go to other planets to steal resources. You know, you watch I don't know if you've seen, you probably have, that that Netflix movie Don't Look Up, where in the one part of the movie they find out that there's an asteroid with trillions of dollars worth of resources. Well, no, they find the asteroid that's coming at them is full of trillions of dollars of resources. And it's obviously a parody on like real life, but in the movie, the president wants to, instead of stopping it, they want to mine it and cash in on the big prize. And so the scientists get all angry and confused, like, why wouldn't you just blow up the asteroid and save Earth instead of just going and mining it? Like, that makes no sense. But there was a news article, I don't know who posted it or where it was from, but there was a news article posted about there's a meteor, an asteroid meteor, same thing, and it also had trillions of dollars worth of resources. They could mine it. Realistically, they could, but the only thing holding them back is technology. Technology is holding them back because there's no technological advancements that would allow them to successfully and safely mine that asteroid. But if, like I said, but here's the thing: if technology wasn't an issue, you bet these capitalists would go and mine that thing and cash in. You know, Elon or Bezos, they're trying to be the first trillionaire. It's going to happen unless we do something about it, but it's going to happen at some point. But yeah, like, you know, I don't understand why you need that much money. I don't see the point or the reason for having billions of dollars in the first place. But they got, like people say, you got to be some special kind of insane to want to hoard money while people are starving, unhoused. It's ridiculous. But it's important that we keep fighting for these things. It's a reason why I still fight. Because the reason why I became a communist in the first place was because I just saw the issues with the current system and the discrepancies and the issues, and I was like, well, hey, that's not right. That's not how it should be. And so, and also because of my own personal experiences with my own life, I saw what it was like, and I was like, I don't want that for myself. I don't want that for anybody else either. I don't think anybody should have to deal with that. And so that's what led me to become a communist, and what led me to start fighting for change. But I was watching a TikTok. A guy I follow. He's really cool because he's very knowledgeable on topics of in regard to communism, socialism, that sort of thing. So he made a post talking about a vanguard party, and then he showed the I don't know if it's I don't know what you'd call it, the rule book, the guide of the CPUSA back in the 30s, and it talked about how a vanguard party should operate. And essentially, if you don't know what a vanguard party is, it's a party that represents the people, the workers, and essentially it's also a party that is actively pursuing a revolution as a means to an ends, to achieve their goal. Now, the earlier CPUSA days, back in the 30s and 20s and 30s, when they had like millions of members, like tens of millions of members at their height, they were definitely like vanguard, like serious, all about that stuff. Problem is, over time, they become more liberal and more, more liberal. I mean, nowadays, you go and look at the CPUSA website and read all their stuff. They're against revolution completely. They want nothing to do with that. All they want is to try to take power through the electoral system, which by this point, that system is too far gone to be saved. It's too corrupt. The two parties have cemented themselves into the electoral system, and there's no chance of stopping that anytime soon. So we really need a vanguard party in this country, one that's connected to the workers, with the unions, the people, because by then we will be able to, begin to network, build infrastructure, and to support one another through this struggle. And then eventually, down the line, we'll be able to get into the realm of revolution and potentially taking that step. But it's going to take some time, and it's going to take a vanguard party that doesn't yet exist. And we're going to need... America's going to need its Lenin or its Castro. We don't have that yet. But somebody's going to step up and be that Castro, be that Lenin that will push America forward. Till then, we just got to kind of keep advocating, keep teaching, and, promoting communism, socialism, and as well as advocating for the worker and the workers' rights. But until then, we just have to keep up with those things so that we can one day get to a point where we're all class conscious and we all understand the gravity of the situation and the necessity for a socialist revolution. It's going to take time. But we'll get there. We'll get there someday. Yeah, I've got nothing else to say. I mean, I've just been rambling on. That's really all this episode is meant to be. I didn't have no set, script or any schedule or any sort of thing of what to talk about. I just felt like speaking. So, yeah. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you can. I know I don't post anymore on Apple Podcast or Spotify, and that's because I have to pay to get a premium subscription to be able to have more storage for my podcast. So I know I don't post there, but if you could go to Apple Podcasts, leave me a 5-star review and a comment. Go to Spotify. If you can do the same thing on Spotify, please do that. Otherwise, that's going to be it for this episode. Also, YouTube. If you can leave a like on YouTube, leave a comment, help boost the algorithm, get us noticed. I'm trying to get monetized. Again, I haven't been able to get monetized for a while because YouTube has had an issue with me, with my content. That's why they demonetized me, months ago, maybe a year ago. So I'm trying to get monetized on YouTube so I can start posting and start making money off that, so I can begin to grow the podcast and make it bigger. But yeah, episode 9, right? Yeah, episode 9. This has been the Revolution Today podcast. See you in the next episode.
You will not be able to stay home, brother. You will will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out from here during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not be brought to you by Xerox in 4 parts without commercial interruptions. The revolution will not